Hello, my name is Jace Stone. At 28, I am the CEO of a major company in the United States, where the city lights never dim and million-dollar deals are signed daily. People look at me and see a strong, confident man dressed in a crisp suit with a sharp gaze. They applaud, calling me inspiring, a winner. But if you ask me about my childhood, I'd only give a faint smile because behind this glamorous facade is a story I rarely share. It's a journey shrouded in darkness, where I grew up in a house I never truly belonged to. I was born in a small suburban house, where gray walls and a cold atmosphere enveloped everything. My father, Paul Stone, the man I once called Dad with all the innocence of a child, never looked at me with love. To him, I was nothing more than a burden, an unwanted presence he was forced to raise. Every time I tried to get his attention, whether by bringing home a scribbled drawing from kindergarten or telling a story in my childish voice, he'd merely glance at me, let out a dismissive grunt, and turn away. "Don't bother me," he'd say, his voice as cold as ice. Those simple words cut like a knife, slicing into my tender heart, leaving scars I wouldn't recognize until much later. But there was once a light in that darkness. My mother. She was a gentlewoman, with a smile as warm as sunlight in the depths of winter. Every night when my father was asleep or preoccupied with work, she'd pull me into her arms, gently stroke my messy hair and whisper, "Jace, you are my pride." Those words were like a soothing melody, easing the wounds left by my father's cold stares. She'd tell me fairy tales about knights who overcame darkness to find the light. Nestled in her arms, feeling her warmth, I believed that as long as I had her, I had nothing to fear. But that happiness was as fragile as a dream. When I was 6, my mother gave birth to my younger brother, Dylan. He was a tiny baby with big round eyes and a cry that pierced the night. I loved Dylan, loved the way he gripped my finger with his tiny hand. But after giving birth to him, my mother's health deteriorated visibly. She grew frail, her eyes sunken, her smile fading. I still remember those final days when she lay in a hospital bed, her voice weak but still calling out to me, "Jace, no matter what happens, you have to be strong." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, not realizing it would be the last time I heard her voice. She passed away when I was just 7, leaving me alone in a house now filled only with the sound of wind slipping through the cracks of the doors. That house, already cold, became a tomb of loneliness. Instead of drawing closer to me to share our grief, my father seemed to push me further away. I became a shadow in my own home, a silent child retreating to a corner, clutching my mother's framed photo for the warmth I'd lost. I'd sit for hours staring at her radiant smile in the picture, wondering if I had done something wrong to be left behind like this. A few years later, when I was 10, my father remarried. The woman who entered our home wore a sweet smile, but I quickly realized it was just a mask. My stepmother never saw me as her son. To her, I was an inconvenience, a child who didn't belong in the perfect world she wanted to create. She never called me by my name, only "Hey" or "that kid." "Hey, get me some water," she'd order in a cold tone while stroking Dylan's hair. I obeyed silently, not out of fear, but because I didn't know what else to do. But Dylan, my little brother, was different. He was my father's golden child, and my stepmother knew it. She spoiled him excessively, as if it would solidify her place in the family. She showered Dylan with new clothes, expensive toys, and constant praise in front of my father. "Dylan is so smart," she'd exclaim whenever he brought home an average grade. "My precious boy," she'd say, hugging him tightly while I stood in the corner staring at my worn-out shoes. My father, caught up in this favoritism, poured all his affection into Dylan. He hugged him, bragged about him to the neighbors, calling him the pride of the family. Every time Dylan did something, no matter how small, like drawing a picture or kicking a ball into a goal, the house would erupt in applause and praise. And me? I received only scornful looks, errands to run, or worse, words that cut like blades. "You're always useless," my father once shouted when I dropped a glass of water in the kitchen. "Don't embarrass me," he said when I brought home an A instead of an A+. Those words, repeated over and over, were like hammer blows to my self-esteem, making me believe I was truly worthless. My stepmother, with her cunning, made things even worse. She assigned me endless chores, cleaning the house, washing dishes, tidying rooms, while Dylan played with his shiny new toys. "Jace, why are you so slow? Look at Dylan, so quick and clever." Her comparisons, whether gentle or harsh, were like salt rubbed into my wounds. Once I overheard her whispering to my father, "Jace will probably never amount to anything. Thank goodness we have Dylan, or this family would be a disgrace." I stood behind the door, clenching my fists, swallowing my tears to keep from crying. I grew accustomed to being overlooked. I learned to sit quietly in a corner, listening to Dylan's laughter and my parents' praise. I learned to hide my sadness, to shed tears only when no one could see. Every night I lay on my creaky old bed in a cramped room, staring at the cracked ceiling, clutching my mother's photo like a treasure. "Mom, what should I do?" I'd whisper, but only silence answered. I craved love, a hug, a word of encouragement, but all I had was loneliness, as cold as my own shadow. Once I tried to make my father happy. I remember that day clearly. I spent a whole week drawing a picture of our family. My father, stepmother, Dylan, and me, standing together under a sunny sky. Nervously, I showed it to him, hoping he'd smile or pat my shoulder like he did with Dylan. But he only glanced at it and snapped, "You have too much free time to waste on this nonsense. Go do something useful." My stepmother smirked, and Dylan just looked at me with a fleeting hint of pity but said nothing. The drawing fell to the floor, its edges crumpled, and I felt my heart being crushed. I ran to my room, tore the drawing to pieces, tears streaming down my face. From that day on, I never tried to make my father happy again. Those years I lived like a shadow in my own home. I did whatever my stepmother asked to avoid her scolding. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. "Why are you so slow?" she'd yell as I scrubbed the floor. "You can't do anything right," my father would add, his voice heavy. "I don't understand why you're even here." Those words etched themselves into my mind like scars that would never heal. I began to believe I was truly useless, unworthy of love. But deep inside, I clung to a tiny spark of hope. Every night, holding my mother's photo, I remembered her words, "You are my pride." Those words were a faint flame, but enough to keep me from breaking. I told myself that one day I would prove I wasn't a burden, wasn't unwanted. I would rise, leave this cold house, and find a place where I belonged. My childhood was a long string of lonely days, where I yearned for love but received only indifference and harsh words. I didn't know then that those years were just the beginning of a longer, more painful journey filled with challenges. But it was in that darkness that I learned resilience, learned to hold on to hope no matter how fragile. And my story, the story of a forgotten boy, was only just beginning. At 22, standing at the university gates, clutching my honors degree, I was filled with a mix of pride and longing. 4 years of relentless study, sleepless nights, cramming and pushing through pressure had crystallized into this piece of paper. Proof that I wasn't the useless boy my father once called me. I had done it despite the scornful looks, the harsh words, and the cold house I grew up in. I thought that today, graduation day, would be the day I'd finally be seen, even just a little, as part of the family. I was wrong. The graduation party was held at home, with long tables draped in white cloth and the air thick with the aroma of food. Relatives gathered, their laughter and chatter filling the space, wine glasses glinting under the lights. I stood in a corner in a slightly tight rented suit, holding a glass of soda instead of wine, trying to blend into the festive atmosphere. But deep down, I was waiting for a glance from my father, a word of praise, even just a nod. Just once I wanted to hear him say, "Jace, you did well." But that hope quickly shattered. My father, his face flushed from wine, stood up mid-party, one hand clapping Dylan's shoulder, my younger brother, his eyes beaming with pride. "This is the true pride of our family," he declared, his voice booming like thunder, drawing everyone's attention. Dylan, only 19, stood there with a shy smile while my stepmother, with her saccharine grin, chimed in, "Dylan just got an A in math, did you all know? He's truly the star of this house." The room erupted in enthusiastic applause, a chorus celebrating my little brother, whom I once loved but who now cast a shadow that eclipsed me. I sat at the end of the table, my soda glass cold in my hand, feeling as if the world was shrinking, leaving me as a forgotten speck of dust. Relatives clapped and laughed, echoing my father and stepmother's words, but I caught a few pitying glances directed my way. Aunt Mary, the only one who ever showed me kindness, whispered to someone nearby, "Poor boy." But she quickly fell silent, unwilling to disrupt the party's cheerful mood. I forced a smile, raising my glass to blend in, but inside a storm of shame and loneliness raged. I was used to being overlooked. I was used to Dylan being the center of attention while I remained a faint shadow. But today I had still hoped, even just a little, that my father would see me differently. I had learned to hide my pain, to smile even as my heart bled, but deep down, I was still the boy who clutched my mother's photo, yearning for a day when I'd be loved. And just when I thought I could endure one more moment of being ignored, a devastating truth crashed down, tearing apart everything I thought I knew about myself. My father stood up again, but this time the smile on his face was gone, replaced by a cold, expressionless mask. The room grew quiet, as if everyone sensed something was coming. He looked straight at me, his gaze sharp as a blade, and said in a low, clear voice, "Jace, on the occasion of your graduation, I want to tell you the truth. I'm not your real father. From now on, you're on your own." Time seemed to stop. The room fell deathly silent, with only the sound of my ragged breathing echoing in my head. My heart ached as if it were being crushed, leaving me unable to breathe. Those words, like a single brutal strike, severed the last thread connecting me to the man I'd called my father for 22 years. I stared at him, hoping it was just a drunken outburst, hoping he'd laugh and say it was a joke. But no. His eyes were cold, devoid of remorse, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. Then, as if to drive the cruelty deeper, he bent down and pulled an old, battered suitcase from under the table. With a swift motion, he flung it to the floor. The lid sprang open and the keepsakes tied to my mother and me spilled across the ground. The framed photo of us, the wooden toy she'd made for me, and her half-written notebook filled with her scribbled dreams for me. They lay there like the shattered pieces of a life trampled without mercy. I knelt down, my trembling hands picking up the broken frame. The glass was cracked, but my mother's smile remained, gentle and warm as ever. My tears blurred her image. In that moment, every childhood memory flooded back. The lonely nights clutching this photo, my father's harsh words, my stepmother's indifference, and the favoritism toward Dylan. It all replayed like a slow-motion film, and now, even the last fragment of my mother's memory had been thrown to the floor as if it held no value. I looked up and caught my stepmother's gaze. She sat still, her lips curled into a cold smile as if she'd long awaited this moment. No protest, no trace of guilt. She just looked at me like I was a stranger not worth her concern. Dylan, sitting beside her, lowered his head, his eyes a mix of pity and faint contempt. He said nothing, but that look was enough to tell me. Even Dylan, the brother I once loved, didn't see me as family. The room remained silent, broken only by faint whispers from relatives. My God, how could they do that to the boy in front of everyone? A distant aunt murmured, but her voice quickly faded into the heavy air. No one stood up for me. No one dared confront my father. They just looked with pity, then turned away as if my existence was an inconvenience. I clutched the photo frame to my chest and stood up, fighting to keep my tears from falling. I didn't want them to see me weak, didn't want them to think I was defeated. But inside, everything was collapsing. The man I'd called my father for 22 years had just declared I wasn't his son. The house I grew up in, however cold and harsh, was no longer mine. I felt uprooted, adrift in a cold, empty void, unsure of who I was or where I'd go. I walked out of the room carrying the suitcase filled with the broken pieces of my memories. The sound of the party's laughter faded behind me, but the pain in my heart didn't. I stood in the yard under a pitch-black night sky, feeling as if the whole world had turned its back on me. The cold wind cut through my thin suit, but that chill was nothing compared to the ice in my heart. I walked, not knowing where I was going. My heavy feet dragged along the road leading out of the familiar neighborhood. Each step was a fresh cut to my already broken heart. I had no home to return to, no one to call family. It was just me, the suitcase, and a pain that followed like an uninvited companion. The night enveloped me, the dim streetlights casting shadows on my face, reflecting my red, swollen eyes. Yet I was determined not to let the tears fall. I had cried too much in those lonely years, and now I told myself I had to be strong. I wandered to an old bus station where rows of weathered buses stood under flickering neon lights. Rain began to fall, cold droplets seeping into my jacket. I huddled under a small awning, clutching the suitcase tightly to protect my mother's keepsakes from getting wet. The rain grew heavier, its patter mingling with my sighs. I sat there, shivering, feeling like an outcast abandoned by the world. Questions swirled endlessly in my mind. Where do I go now? Who am I? And if he's not my real father, who is? I bowed my head, gripping my mother's photo frame, and whispered, "Mom, what do I do now?" At that moment, a figure emerged through the rain. A middle-aged bus driver wearing a worn-out coat approached me. His face was weathered, his eyes deep as if they had seen too much of life. He stopped and stared at me, his gaze unwavering. I looked up, wary, my heart racing. "Are you Jace Stone?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. I frowned, stepping back, clutching the suitcase tighter. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice trembling, unsure if it was fear or exhaustion making me distrustful. The man didn't answer immediately. He silently pulled an old sealed envelope from his coat, its paper yellowed with time. He handed it to me, his eyes never leaving my face. "I was tasked with giving you this on the day you graduate. I'm just the messenger." My trembling hands took the envelope. On its front, in slanted, shaky yet strangely beautiful handwriting, were the words, "To my son." My heart stopped. I looked at the driver, hoping for more explanation, but he only nodded, then turned and vanished into the rain like a ghost. I stood there alone under the small awning, holding the envelope as a storm of emotions surged within me. I tore open the envelope, careful not to damage its contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with trembling, heartfelt, handwritten words. The writer claimed to be my real father. He wrote that he had never stopped searching for me, that he had been kept from my life by forces beyond his control. He explained that he had entrusted this letter to someone to be delivered to me on my graduation day, the day he believed I'd be strong enough to face the truth. I read and reread the letter, each word carving itself into my heart. "My son, I have never stopped thinking of you. Every day I've lived with the pain of not being by your side, but I believe that no matter how cruel the world is to you, you will find your own path. If one day you want to meet me, come to this address." At the bottom of the letter, blurred by faded ink, was a clear address. I gripped the paper tightly, my heart torn between doubt and hope. Could someone really have been searching for me for 22 years? Or was this just another cruel trick, another way for the world to mock me? If he was my father, why had he let me endure so many years of loneliness and shame? I tucked the letter into my jacket, holding it like a lifeline in a raging storm. Despite the anger, the hurt, and the doubt, a small spark of hope flickered deep inside me. I didn't know who this man was or if his words were true, but that letter, with its shaky handwriting, was the first thing in years that made me feel I might not be entirely abandoned. The rain kept falling, but I no longer felt cold. I stood up, clutching the suitcase, and walked into the night. That letter became a tormenting paradox. Proof of a stolen fatherhood and a question about a truth buried for 22 years. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that even if the world turned its back on me, I wouldn't let myself fall. Not now. Not after everything I had been through. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the grind of survival as a way to escape the pain. The letter from the man claiming to be my real father sat folded in my pocket, but I wasn't ready to face it. My heart was torn between a longing for the truth and bitter doubt. If he's really my father, why did he let me grow up so alone? Why didn't he come sooner? Those questions haunted me, stealing sleep night after night. But above all, I wanted to prove I could stand on my own, that I didn't need anyone's pity, not even from a father I'd never met. By day, I roamed the city, knocking on company doors with a crumpled resume in hand. Time after time, I faced cold rejections. "No experience, we don't need you," they'd say, their eyes indifferent, as if I were invisible. A few places hired me, but only for grueling jobs, hauling, cleaning, or washing cars, for wages so meager they barely covered rent. I gritted my teeth and worked, even when my hands bled, even when my back ached after long shifts. Every coin I earned, no matter how small, was proof that I wasn't the useless person Paul had called me. At night, I returned to a dilapidated apartment in a cheap part of town. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked with a steady drip, and the air reeked of damp mold as if it wanted to swallow me whole. The creaky bed groaned with every movement, and the sounds of neighbors' arguments seeped through thin walls. A sad soundtrack to my life. I clutched my mother's photo frame, my fingers tracing her faded smile, and gripped the letter like it was my last tether to hope. Some nights, under the dim glow of a yellow bulb, I reread the letter, searching its trembling words for a reason to believe I wasn't entirely abandoned. But doubt always crept back. Is this the truth, or just another illusion? In those desperate days, I was torn between two versions of myself. One part wanted independence, to prove I needed no one, that I could build a life from the ashes. The other part yearned for answers, for the truth behind my lonely years. Paul's cold stares and the favoritism toward Dylan. The letter was a small flame, warming yet burning me. I feared that seeking this man would only bring another wound, but I also couldn't live forever with the question, who am I really? Finally, with nothing left to lose, I decided to follow the address in the letter, not to beg, not to seek refuge, but to face the truth, no matter how painful. I stood before a well-kept house in the suburbs, far from my run-down neighborhood. Lush green trees, white painted walls, and a polished wooden door. It all belonged to a world I'd never touched. I took a deep breath, clutching the suitcase with my mother's keepsakes, and knocked. The door opened, and a middle-aged man appeared. His hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered, but his eyes held a deep, decades-long pain. He looked at me, his eyes widening as if time had stopped. Then in a trembling voice he whispered, "I'm Dennis, your real father." I froze, my hand tightening around the suitcase. In that moment, I wanted to believe him, to throw myself into his arms like a child starved for love. But then a surge of anger rose, choking me. Why are you only here now? Where were you when I needed you most? I didn't say it, but my eyes must have betrayed me because he quietly invited me in, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Come in, son. I owe you an explanation." In a warm room filled with the scent of old wood and soft light from a fireplace, the truth unfolded. He told me he and my mother had loved each other deeply despite their different backgrounds. He was a car mechanic. She was the daughter of a wealthy, prestigious family. My grandparents fiercely opposed their relationship, calling him a lowly nobody unfit for her. When my mother became pregnant with me, they forced her to marry a more stable man, Paul, my adoptive father. Dennis tried to stay close to her, to me, but Paul blocked him at every turn, returning his gifts and threatening him. "Come near us again and I'll ruin you." With his social connections, Paul smeared Dennis, painting him as a failure in everyone's eyes, including my mother's. Dennis's voice broke as he pulled an old wooden box from a drawer filled with unsent letters and small gifts he'd bought for me over the years. A toy car, a picture book, a tiny knitted scarf. "I never abandoned you," he said, his voice trembling, tears streaming down his cheeks. "For 22 years I was kept from you. Every day I lived with the agony of not being able to protect you." I sat in silence, tears welling up, unable to hold them back. A storm of conflicting emotions raged within me. Part of me was furious, wanting to scream, "Why didn't you try harder? Why did you let me grow up in loneliness with insults and scorn?" I thought of the nights I clung to my mother's photo, yearning for a hug, a kind word. I thought of the days Paul called me useless, the cold dinners where I was just a shadow. My childhood, which should have been filled with love, was stolen by forces he couldn't overcome. That truth was a knife, cutting into old scars, leaving me breathless with pain. But then, looking into Dennis's eyes filled with pain, regret, and unspoken love, I felt a strange warmth. For the first time, I knew I hadn't been truly abandoned. The things he kept were proof that, in the darkness of my life, someone had been thinking of me, silently praying for my safety. I touched the tiny scarf in the wooden box, imagining my mother and him choosing it for me, and my heart melted, both aching and soothed. I wanted to blame him, but I also wanted to embrace him, to feel I was no longer alone. Before leaving, I stood, still clutching the suitcase, my voice trembling but steady. I don't know how to trust you yet," I said, looking straight into his eyes, searching for a final spark in the storm of emotions. "This truth is too big, too painful. I've lived 22 years without you, with only my mother's memory. I need time to understand, to accept. But I'll give you a chance, not for you, but for me, because I want to know who I really am." Dennis looked at me, tears falling silently, and nodded, as if understanding that was all I could offer for now. That meeting became a turning point. I began to understand the reasons behind the tragedies that shaped my life. The letters, the gifts, and Dennis's choked voice were the first pieces filling the void in my heart. From the pain, a spark of hope emerged, not to erase the scars, but to give me strength to move forward. I left that house carrying the truth and a new resolve. I would not let my past define me. Never. The wounds from my childhood still simmered within me, but meeting Dennis, my biological father, planted a new anchor in my heart. He didn't try to pull me into his arms or make grand promises. He just looked at me, his eyes gentle yet resolute, and said something I'd never forget. "I'll always be here when you need me, but I don't want to take away your chance to prove yourself." Those words were like a soft breeze, not enough to calm the storm inside me, but enough to make me want to stand up and keep going. I realized that even with a real father out there somewhere, I still had to forge my own path. Through Dennis's quiet introduction, I landed a job at a reputable company, but at the lowest rung, an office assistant handling menial tasks. No one there knew I was the son of the big boss, and I didn't want them to. I wanted to prove I could stand on my own 2 feet without relying on anyone, not even the man who'd given me that fateful letter. I walked into the company in a worn-out shirt, burning with pride even though my pockets held only a few coins. Those early days were grueling. I answered phones, made coffee, photocopied documents, and ran errands across the office. Colleagues looked at me, a young man with an honors degree, and sneered, "A college grad doing photocopies? What a waste." Their words stung like salt in old wounds, echoing Paul's cold voice, "You're always useless." But I stayed silent, gritting my teeth. I told myself, I'm not worthless. I'll prove it. Every small failure at work became a lesson. I learned how to pitch an idea persuasively, negotiate with difficult clients, and read financial reports late into the night under dim lights. Some nights in my rundown apartment, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, I pored over documents, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. Dennis visited occasionally, never staying long, offering brief advice. In business, it's not about winning fast. It's about knowing when to wait for your moment. Those simple, sharp words were like a guiding light, keeping me from losing my way. Slowly, my talent began to shine. During a meeting, I proposed a bold idea to streamline operations, which significantly boosted the company's revenue. At first, my superiors eyed me with skepticism, but when the results came, they took notice. I didn't just work hard. I carried an unyielding fire forged in years of loneliness and disdain. My leadership ability, something I never knew I had, began to earn the respect of colleagues and subordinates. They stopped calling me the photocopy guy and started seeing me as someone with vision. Within a few years, I rose from a boy cast out with a suitcase of keepsakes to a mid-level manager. Each promotion was a step out of the darkness of my past. Every move forward wasn't just professional success. It was a resounding declaration within me. I'm not worthless. I'll stand tall on my own. I worked tirelessly, not for fame, but to prove to Paul, to my stepmother, to Dylan, and to myself that I deserved to exist, to be loved, to be respected. By 28, I stood at a height no one in my former family could have imagined. I became the CEO of a major company where my decisions shaped an entire industry. Each success was a hammer blow shattering the insults of my past, but also a reminder that this journey wasn't just about winning. It was about finding myself. Yet deep inside, I still carried the shadow of the boy who huddled in a cold house, clutching my mother's photo for warmth. I thought I'd left the past behind, but one day fate pulled me back to where it all began. On a business trip, I found myself driving through the old neighborhood, the narrow streets, the gnarled trees, and the house that once held my entire world. I hadn't planned to stop, but a familiar figure made me slow down. It was the neighbor from years ago, the one who used to secretly slip me a piece of bread when my stepmother made me clean the yard all day without food. She recognized me instantly, her eyes lighting up with a mix of surprise and joy. "Jace, is that you? My goodness, you've changed so much." She pulled me into a small corner cafe, her voice lowering as she recounted what had happened to the family that raised me. After casting me out, Paul and my stepmother thought they'd live comfortably, free of the thorn in their side. That was me. But life, like a harsh verdict, made them pay for their cruelty. Paul, now old and frail, couldn't hold a steady job. Years of relying on power and favoritism had left him slow and outdated. Debts piled up, forcing him to sell off assets, from the car he once boasted about to the expensive decor that adorned their home. My stepmother, accustomed to a life of luxury, couldn't cope with poverty. She turned to blaming Paul, their arguments echoing through the night until finally she left, abandoning him and Dylan in a house now nothing more than an empty shell. As for Dylan, the brother once spoiled beyond measure, he was now a shadow of himself. The neighbor sighed as she spoke of him. That boy was pampered too much, never learned to stand on his own. He dropped out of school, couldn't hold a job. Now he clings to his father, but Paul's already broken. The house, once filled with laughter and lit up with boastful parties, was now a crumbling ruin. It had no life left, as if the cruelty of its inhabitants had drained its soul. Listening to her, I stood frozen, feeling time rewind. Memories of my childhood flooded back. The meals where I was given scraps, my stepmother's scornful glares, the nights I huddled in the rain after being locked out. I recalled Paul's icy voice, "You're always useless." A cold satisfaction flickered within me like a small flame in the dark. They're paying for it, I thought, paying for their own cruelty. They had seen me as worthless, cast me out of their lives, and now they'd lost everything. Not just their wealth, but the pride they'd pinned on Dylan. Yet deep inside, a sharp pang of pain stirred. After all, that house was once my home. It was where my mother held me, whispering that I was her pride. It was where I'd hoped, even just once, for Paul to look at me with love. That pain wasn't weakness. It was a reminder that I was still human, still carrying memories that could never be erased. I stood there under the shade of an old tree, staring at the hollow shell of a house, my heart heavy. I walked away, my eyes darkening, a cold thought rising within me. If they despised me so much, I'll show them what it feels like to lose everything. It wasn't blind revenge, but a quiet resolve. I would live better, stronger, to prove that I didn't just survive. I surpassed them, surpassed the ghosts of my past. I got into my car, pressed the accelerator, and left the old trees and neighborhood behind. As the days passed, I immersed myself in work, running the company with an almost feverish energy. Long meetings, million-dollar contracts, handshakes with powerful people. All of it was my way of proving I wasn't the abandoned boy of my past. But when I returned to my luxurious apartment, when the city lights dimmed and silence settled in, I found myself face to face with the same Jace, still carrying unanswered questions. I knew the truth about Dennis and his love for my mother, but a piece was still missing. Why had Paul been so cruel to me? What made him see me as a thorn in his side? One evening, after an exhausting day, I visited Dennis. His well-kept suburban house felt less foreign now. I sat across from him in the warm room, the fireplace casting soft light on his weathered face. I told him about the old neighborhood, what the neighbor had shared, and the downfall of the family that raised me. The words poured out, not because I sought sympathy, but because I needed guidance to move forward. I don't know what to do with the past, I said, my voice low. I've succeeded, proven I'm not useless. But every time I think of them, Paul, my stepmother, Dylan, I feel an anger that won't fade. I want to close that chapter, but I don't know where to start. Dennis looked at me, his eyes gentle yet profound, as if reflecting years of regret. He spoke softly, but with weight. You have every right to hate him, Jace. What he did to you, to your mother, isn't easily forgiven. But you also have a right to the truth. The only person who still holds memories of your mother is him. Sometimes, to close the past, you have to face it one last time. Not to forgive, but to free yourself. His advice was like a stone dropping into the still lake of my heart, sending ripples outward. Back in my spacious apartment, I lay on my wide bed, unable to sleep. Dennis's words echoed, mingling with memories of my mother. Her gentle smile, her frail hand holding mine for the last time. I thought of Paul, his cold stare, the insults etched into my mind. Should I return, confront him, and seek the final answers? Or should I let the past rest like a healed scar that still leaves a mark? For nights, I wrestled with that thought. At times, I wanted to let it go, to leave Paul and that family in their ruin. But a part of me craved the truth, not to heal, but to understand. I wanted to know why he treated me so cruelly, why my gentle mother entrusted me to a man who never loved me. Finally, I decided to return. Not to forgive or reconcile, but to hear the buried truth, so I could move forward without looking back. I drove to the old neighborhood on a gloomy afternoon, the gray sky threatening to swallow all light. The house looked even more desolate now. I stood at the door, fists clenched, taking a deep breath before knocking. Paul opened the door, aged and weary, his sunken eyes filled with bitterness. Seeing me, his lips twitched in a mix of surprise and veiled shame. "Jace," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing back here?" I stepped inside without answering. The room was barren, with only an old wooden table and a few rickety chairs. Gone were the expensive decorations, the lively chatter of past parties. I sat across from him, feeling like I was facing a ghost from my past. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of its former arrogance. "You were never my son. I raised you only because of a promise to your mother before she died. She begged me to care for you until you were grown. But to me, you were just a burden, a thorn in my side. I kept Dennis away because I didn't want anyone else to have a claim in this house but me. When you grew up, I had no reason to keep you anymore." His words were a cold blade, sharp but not surprising. I sat still for a moment, memories of my mother's frail hand flashing before me, as if she were standing somewhere in this room looking at me with her gentle eyes. I recalled her voice, weak but resolute. "Jace, you have to be strong. I clenched my fists, looked straight at Paul, and spoke calmly but icily. You thought you controlled my childhood. You were wrong. You made yourself the failure. I grew up not because of you, but by overcoming everything you did. Every time you called me useless, every time you pushed me out, I found a way to stand up. And now you've lost everything. Not because of me, but because of your own cruelty. The room fell silent. Paul lowered his head, his trembling hands resting on the table, unable to utter a word. In his eyes I saw an emptiness, as if he realized he had destroyed himself. I stood, turned, and walked away, carrying the final truth in a fierce resolve. I had closed the wounds of my past, not by forgiving, but by confronting and letting go. Time marched on, and I threw myself into the daily grind, managing the company with relentless meetings, million-dollar contracts, and endless business trips. But no matter how far I'd come or how new a life I'd built, the old neighborhood and house lingered like a shadow in my mind. The anger had dulled, but thoughts of Paul, my stepmother, and Dylan still brought a bitter pang to my heart. One day, news reached me through a close friend who still kept ties with the old neighborhood. The house, once my home but also my childhood hell, was up for sale. Paul, now old and broken, could no longer hold on to it. Debt had devoured everything he once prided himself on, and the house was his last remaining asset. I sat quietly in my office, gazing out at the glittering city, my hand unconsciously touching my mother's framed photo on the desk. A sharp, clear thought struck me. This was my chance to close the past, not with words but with action. I didn't show my face. I didn't want Paul or anyone to know I was behind it. I asked my friend Mark, who had witnessed my journey from the days of wandering with an old suitcase, to buy the house in his name. Are you sure, Jace? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. I'm sure, I replied, calm but resolute. This isn't revenge. It's my way of taking back what they thought they'd stolen from me. Mark nodded, and the deal proceeded quietly. Papers were signed, money was transferred, and the house changed hands. Only when the transaction was complete did I decide to reveal myself. On a gloomy afternoon, I drove to the old neighborhood as if it would be my final confrontation with the truth. The house loomed before me, overgrown with weeds, the front door sagging, the walls that once echoed Dylan's laughter now silent, like a soulless corpse. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a greeting from the past. Paul was there, slumped in the old wooden chair, his aged, weary figure radiating exhaustion. He sat alone, his eyes clouded with bitterness, as if forgotten by time and fate. When I stepped inside, he looked up, stunned. It took him a moment to recognize me. You, what are you doing here? Come to mock me? He asked, his voice hoarse, a mix of panic and venom, as if my presence was a reminder of his failure. I didn't answer immediately. I placed a stack of purchase documents on the table, each page crisp with a clear red stamp. This house has a new owner, I said, my voice slow, calm, but sharp as a blade. The new owner is me. Paul froze. His trembling hands flipped through the papers, his eyes vacant, unable to comprehend what was happening. He looked at me, then at the documents, then back at me, as if searching for a sign that this was a joke. But it wasn't. The truth lay before him. The boy he'd cast out, called useless, was now the legal owner of this house. I stood there, scanning the room, its walls, its worn wooden frames where my childhood had been buried. I looked straight at him and continued, my voice low but piercing. You once wanted to erase me from your life. Now look, this house, these memories, and the power you used to control me, they all belong to me now. Paul sank into his chair, his shoulders slumping as if his last ounce of strength had been drained. He said nothing more, only stared at the floor, his eyes empty like a man defeated by his own choices. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind an old, lonely figure in a house that no longer belonged to him. As I stepped outside, Dylan appeared out of nowhere. He ran toward me, disheveled, his eyes red and swollen. I stopped, looking at him. The brother once spoiled, once the center of all attention. Now he stood before me, stripped of pride. "You've got everything," Dylan said, his voice breaking with a mix of tears and bitterness. "Why won't you leave me a way to live?" His words were like an arrow, but they didn't shake me. I looked into his eyes and replied calm but firm. "No one hands you a way to live, Dylan. You have to find it yourself, something you've never done." Then I walked away without looking back. On the doorstep I paused, taking a deep breath. The sky was still gray, but inside I felt an unfamiliar peace, as if I'd finally closed a circle of tragedy. On the doorstep I paused, taking a deep breath. The sky was still gray, but the anger within me had vanished. In its place was a strange serenity, as if I had finally closed a tragic circle. The house behind me, once a prison of loneliness and shame, now belonged to me. Not as a trophy, but as a full stop to the years I was deemed worthless. I walked down the old street, leaving behind the cracked walls, the painful memories, and the faded shadows of Paul and Dylan, now mere ghosts in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't need to anymore. In the days that followed, I returned to my hectic life. But something was different. I was no longer working to escape the past or to prove myself to those who had scorned me. The fleeting satisfaction of seeing Paul humbled, his head bowed in disgrace, lasted only a moment. What lingered was a sense of relief, as if I had shed a weight that had pressed on my shoulders for years. I owed them nothing, not Paul, not my stepmother, not Dylan. And more importantly, I no longer owed myself an apology for ever feeling worthless. One early morning, I decided to do something I had put off for too long. I called Dennis, the man with gray-streaked hair and eyes heavy with regret. "Dad, I want to visit Mom," I said, my voice low but steady. He didn't ask questions, only replied, "I'll go with you." I held my mother's photo frame, the one Paul had once shattered, now carefully repaired, its new glass gleaming but still preserving her gentle smile. We drove to the cemetery where she rested, a place I'd visited as a child, sneaking to her grave to whisper words no one else heard. The cemetery was quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and our footsteps on the stone path. I knelt before my mother's grave, placing the photo frame on the headstone, my fingers tracing her faded smile. Dennis stood beside me, silent, but I felt the warmth of his presence. I looked at the engraved letters of her name, and memories flooded back. Nights when she held me close, whispering, "You are my pride." I took a deep breath, my voice trembling but clear. "Mom, I survived. I found Dad, and I made it." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but this time they carried no pain. They were tears of release, of a boy who had finally found light after years of darkness. Dennis quietly placed a hand on my shoulder, saying nothing, but his eyes shone with pride mixed with remorse. I knew he still carried guilt for not protecting me, but in that moment I didn't need apologies. His presence, my mother's photo, and the unveiled truth were enough to make me feel I was no longer alone. Standing before her grave, I realized something profound. True family doesn't come from blood or obligation, but from love and choice. My mother chose to love me even if she had only a few short years with me. Dennis chose not to give up, despite being pushed out of my life. And I chose to rise not for revenge, but to live a life worth living. For her, for him, and for myself. Back in the city, I stepped into my office, where glass walls reflected dazzling lights. I walked out onto the high-rise balcony, gazing at the sparkling city below, its bustling streets and towering buildings telling a story of relentless life. I knew I had traveled a painful circle to reach this point. From the boy huddled in a cold house to the man standing tall in a vast world. Dennis's words echoed in my mind. "You were never abandoned. You were always loved." Those simple, powerful words were like a breeze scattering the last clouds in my heart. My story didn't end with a cry for vengeance or the thrill of watching others fail. It ended with a quiet light, the light of someone who had stepped out of the darkness, found himself, and begun anew. I stood on the balcony, taking a deep breath, feeling the cool evening breeze. I was no longer the abandoned boy. I was Jace Stone, a man who had learned to love himself despite everything.